My life, though, has been dedicated to study of the Church in Russia, and during the period of persecution, our work was seen as one of the main agents in the West for defending religious liberty in the Soviet Union. That was all based on my personal experience as a student. I learnt Russian in the military at the age of 18. I spent a year at Moscow University, 1959 to 1960, and witnessed some of the persecution with my own eyes. It was a time when religious persecution was on the agenda again, and Nikita Khrushchev was bringing in a new anti-religious program. All stages between when we started in '69 and going right through more or less to the present, really, you would find an update on what was happening on the religious front in the Soviet Union, or now in Russia. Our name became well known not only in the West but in Russia as well. Partly, I must say, through the attacks against us in the Soviet press. The anti-religious bodies in the Soviet Union began to put my name into the press as somebody who was, in their words, misrepresenting the religious persecution. And by putting that into the press, people realized that making black white because of their propaganda, they knew that here was somebody who was actually defending religious liberty. So people began to collect information, especially for me, and to smuggle it out in one way or another. It's very rarely realized that Stalin's campaign, and later on Khrushchev's campaign, Brezhnev's campaign, they were anti-religious. They were not favouring the Orthodox Church against Protestants or Catholics. The war was against religion. The Central Committee of the Communist Party established a branch called the Council on Religious Affairs, which was supposed to handle church-state relations. And in fact, what it did, it was an arm of the KGB, and it set up listening posts throughout the regions. Russia itself, quite apart from the other areas of the former Soviet Union like Ukraine or Kazakhstan, Russia itself is divided into 89 political sub-regions, and every single one of those 89 regions had sitting in the capital city a representative of the Council on Religious Affairs, and that representative was supposed to ensure that religion did not gain any toehold, that the anti-religious policy was carried out, that the right number of anti-religious lectures was given in schools and in universities, and that where religious people stepped out of line and were involved in evangelism and so on, outside of the strict limitations of Soviet law, that they were brought to justice. So it was an absolutely coordinated nationwide campaign from the top right through to the bottom. And religious leaders, Baptists, Orthodox, bishops, priests, Catholic leaders, they were all sent to prison. This is something which is very little known, that religion was worse persecuted in the 1960s under Nikita Khrushchev than it was in the early 1950s under Stalin. There is one great exception to that, and that is the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The Ukrainian Catholic Church was liquidated by Stalin in 1945 after World War II because they were Ukrainian nationalists, and he had to, or he determined to cut off the determination of Ukrainians to be independent. Ukraine had been an independent country briefly in the 1920s. So Stalin formulated a policy which was absolutely brutal. It was a policy of murder. The Ukrainian Catholic Church were forced to abandon their own religion and become Orthodox, which most of them refused to do, or if they refused, they were put into prison camp and most of them died. The Jews were always badly treated, and under Stalin throughout, the Jews suffered a great deal because they were Jews. it's a complicated story. There were many Jews who were involved in the revolution, but Stalin was a ferocious anti-Semite, and many of those Jews involved in the revolution. Trotsky was a Jew, the founder really of the Red Army. He was purged by Stalin, and many other Jews, and that anti-religious, anti-Jewish policy carried on throughout. When I was living in Russia in 1959, nobody would admit to being Jewish. I knew several young people who were Jewish, but they would not admit to it. They were absolutely terrified of being identified as Jews. The anti-Semitic campaign was very strong during that time. The murder was usually, as it were, secondary. First of all, somebody would be condemned and put into prison, and then either prisoners would set on that person because there were a lot of criminals who could perhaps win their own freedom by carrying out the KGB instructions and murdering somebody. That could happen. Or sometimes a priest, an Orthodox priest, for example, would be so badly treated in prison that he would die. So it was not usually, and I'm now talking about the 1960s, it was not usually a direct act of judicial murder, but it was secondary in prison. Earlier, in the 1920s and the 1930s, direct murder.